Several European leaders are considering a range of economic responses to Trump's tariff threats over Greenland, but there is no confirmation of military retaliation or invasion plans. Top ambassadors from across Europe held meetings over the weekend where they discussed various options, including what some commentators have called the nuclear option in economic terms. European officials have discussed potentially using the EU's anti-coercion instrument, sometimes called a trade bazooka, in commentary, as one option in response to U.S. tariff threats, though it has not been officially activated yet. This instrument represents one of the most powerful economic levers available to the European Union. European Union ambassadors reached a broad agreement on January 18th that they must intensify their response to the Trump administration's pressure campaign. The calculation being discussed is stark: how to respond to economic threats without escalating to broader conflict. French President Emmanuel Macron has reportedly floated using the EU's anti-coercion instrument, the bloc's biggest tool against what it considers economic coercion. The instrument essentially allows the EU to declare a state coercive and respond with coordinated economic measures, a designation that was never designed with America in mind, but which European leaders are now discussing as a possibility. The atmosphere in European capitals has shifted dramatically. What began as diplomatic concern has evolved into active discussion of economic countermeasures. Foreign ministers are holding consultations, finance ministers are reviewing exposure to American markets, European countries are strengthening defensive cooperation in Greenland and coordinating with NATO allies in response to the tariff row, not preparing for a confrontation with the United States. The collective mood appears to be one of serious deliberation rather than panic. The EU's anti-coercion instrument was originally designed with potential use against China in mind. It was always considered a last resort, the economic equivalent of a powerful deterrent to be threatened but ideally never actually deployed. But now European officials are reportedly discussing whether this instrument could be applied against the United States, which would mean coordinated restrictions on market access for American companies. This would represent an unprecedented rupture in transatlantic economic relations that have been the foundation of Western prosperity since World War II. The mechanics of the anti-coercion instrument are significant. If invoked, it would allow the European Union to restrict market access for companies from the targeted country, impose coordinated tariffs across sectors, and ensure member state responses are unified. American tech giants, agricultural exporters, financial services firms, and manufacturers could all face barriers. The instrument was designed to be so consequential that no country would risk triggering it, but it has never been tested against a major ally. European investors and central banks hold significant amounts of U.S. Treasury debt, which analysts note could be a form of financial leverage if a trade conflict escalated. But there is no confirmed plan to liquidate such holdings. Some commentary has suggested that coordinated selling of Treasury bonds could have significant market effects, though this remains speculation. Trade barriers take time to implement and feel their effects. Financial market actions can have faster impacts, but any such moves would carry enormous risks for European economies as well, a reality that makes actual deployment of these tools highly uncertain. The discussion of these instruments reflects the seriousness with which European leaders view the current tensions. Whether rhetoric translates into action remains to be seen. The costs of economic confrontation would be borne on both sides of the Atlantic, which may ultimately encourage negotiated solutions rather than escalation. While Europe debates economic responses, Canada has been exploring options to diversify away from dependence on American markets. Canada is reported to be deepening some trade and investment ties with China and other partners, but there is no confirmed trillion-dollar formal alliance deal described by Reuters or AP. Prime Minister Mark Carney's recent diplomatic engagement with Beijing has drawn attention to Canada's interest in expanding trade relationships beyond its traditional American focus. Reports suggest discussions about increased Chinese investment in Canadian sectors and expanded trade in various goods. Chinese electric vehicles could potentially gain greater access to the Canadian market, which some analysts suggest could affect the integrated North American auto industry. For decades, the North American auto industry has operated as a cross-border manufacturing system. Parts cross between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico multiple times before a finished vehicle rolls off the line. That integration made all three countries economically interconnected and potentially vulnerable to trade disruptions. Canada appears to be exploring alternatives to this integration. Discussions about Chinese EVs entering the Canadian market, Chinese investment in Canadian manufacturing, and expanded trade in energy and agricultural products all suggest a strategic recalibration. How significant these changes will ultimately be remains uncertain. Much depends on the specific agreements reached and how trade tensions evolve. Additionally, there have been discussions about China increasing purchases of Canadian liquefied natural gas, Canadian canola, and other Canadian products. Canada has vast natural gas reserves that it has struggled to export due to limited pipeline and terminal infrastructure. China's interest in Canadian energy could provide both investment and guaranteed buyers, though the scale and timeline of such arrangements remain unclear. Some commentators suggest that public sentiment in Canada reflects frustration with U.S. tariff threats, but specific polling figures should be attributed to verified surveys. Various reports indicate that some Canadians are actively choosing to avoid American goods in response to trade tensions, though the scale of this phenomenon is difficult to quantify precisely. Anecdotal evidence suggests some consumers are checking labels and switching brands, but comprehensive polling data on the extent of any boycott movement remains limited. The sentiment extends beyond consumer goods, according to some reports. Canadian businesses may be reconsidering American suppliers. Canadian travelers may be choosing destinations other than the United States. Canadian investors may be reviewing exposure to American markets. The relationship that once seemed unbreakable appears to be under strain at multiple levels, though how deep and lasting these changes will be remains uncertain. American media figures have noticed the tensions. Fox News host Laura Ingraham posted that Canada is trying to destroy the North American auto industry. But observers note that Canada's actions appear aimed at survival and diversification rather than destruction. When trade relationships come under pressure, seeking alternative partnerships is a natural economic response rather than an aggressive act. There have been unverified claims circulating in commentary about Trump making hyperbolic statements regarding Canada, but these claims are not confirmed as factual policy pronouncements by reliable sources. Some reports suggest the administration views Canada as strategically vulnerable and believes action is needed. But the specifics of these claims remain difficult to verify through official channels. The framing of Canada as requiring American intervention, if accurate, would be remarkable. Canada is a G7 nation, a founding NATO member, America's largest trading partner, and a democracy with high quality of life indicators. Treating such a country as a problem to be solved rather than a partner to be respected would represent a significant departure from traditional alliance relationships. Prime Minister Carney's response to the general pressure campaign has been to seek alternatives. Reports indicate Canada is positioning itself as part of international efforts to maintain rules-based trade rather than a potential target for absorption. The message appears to be that Canada will work with partners who treat it as an equal rather than accept subordination. The contrast is notable. While Washington applies pressure, Canada explores partnerships with China and others. While tariffs are threatened, Canada diversifies trade relationships. Whether this represents a fundamental realignment or temporary friction depends on how the broader tensions are resolved. The EU has pursued various trade agreements, including with Mercosur, as part of broader strategic diversification, though these processes predate current tensions and are not solely a response to the Greenland dispute. Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and associated nations representing hundreds of millions of consumers would be part of this trade arrangement if finalized. The timing of renewed attention to these agreements is notable. For years, the EU-Mercosur agreement was stalled over environmental concerns and agricultural competition. The current geopolitical context may be adding urgency to these discussions, though the negotiations have their own complex dynamics independent of transatlantic tensions. The broader pattern is worth noting. Major economic blocs are pursuing trade relationships with each other while the Trump administration focuses on tariffs and pressure campaigns. Europe, Canada, China, South America, various parties are exploring expanded ties. Whether this represents a fundamental reorganization of global trade or temporary adjustments remains to be seen. This would represent a significant shift if it accelerates. For decades, the United States championed free trade and open markets. American diplomats negotiated trade agreements. American economists promoted globalization. American businesses built supply chains spanning continents. Other countries learning those lessons and applying them in arrangements that don't include the United States would mark a notable change. The tensions over Greenland carry historical context that deserves attention. Denmark has lost soldiers serving in NATO missions, including in Afghanistan after the United States invoked Article 5 following the September 11th attacks. Danish soldiers killed serving in these missions represent sacrifices made in support of alliance commitments. The United States remains the only country that has ever invoked Article 5, the collective defense provision requiring all NATO members to treat an attack on one as an attack on all. When America called, allies in Canada, Europe, and elsewhere responded. They participated because that's what alliance membership requires. Denmark answered that call. Danish soldiers served in Afghanistan and elsewhere as part of NATO operations. Now, those same allies observe as Washington applies pressure over Danish territory. The contrast between past cooperation and current tensions is not lost on observers in European capitals. The diplomatic implications are significant. Countries that contributed to American-led operations based on alliance solidarity may reconsider such commitments if they perceive the alliance relationship as one-directional. Trust built over decades of cooperation can be damaged more quickly than it was established. Danish troops are conducting military exercises in Greenland as part of defensive coordination with NATO allies. Shortly after Danish Army soldiers arrived in Greenland, they conducted training at shooting ranges, zeroing in their weapons and receiving instruction on operating equipment in freezing temperatures, wind, and snow. The soldiers participate in the Arctic Endurance Exercise, which focuses on defensive capabilities in the northern region. The exercises involve defensive operations, standard military training for Arctic conditions. Troops are learning to operate in challenging environmental conditions. They're coordinating with allied forces from multiple NATO countries who have deployed in solidarity with Denmark. A joint statement was issued from Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. As members of NATO, we are committed to strengthening Arctic security as a shared transatlantic interest. The pre-coordinated Danish exercise, Arctic Endurance, conducted with allies, responds to this necessity. It poses no threat to anyone. We stand in full solidarity with the Kingdom of Denmark and the people of Greenland. The statement continued with a warning about trade measures. Tariff threats undermine transatlantic relations and risk a dangerous downward spiral. We continue to stand united and coordinated in our response. We are committed to upholding our sovereignty. 8 NATO countries, 8 signatures, 8 nations expressing solidarity with Denmark in the face of pressure from Washington. The alliance dynamics are complex when pressure comes from within rather than from external adversaries. Trump has threatened European countries that don't support his position on Greenland with tariffs, 10% starting February 1st, with an additional 25% beginning in June, according to reports. The economic pressure is explicitly connected to the Greenland question. The linkage between trade measures and territorial disputes is notable. This framing goes beyond typical trade deficit concerns or fair practice arguments that usually accompany tariff announcements. Countries that deploy troops to Greenland in solidarity with Denmark or that issue statements supporting Danish sovereignty face the prospect of tariffs. 8 NATO allies have responded with unified statements of defiance. They reject the framing that defensive Arctic exercises constitute provocation. They reject the premise that European solidarity with Denmark justifies economic retaliation. and they are discussing potential countermeasures. The tariff threats may be having effects opposite to their intended purpose. Rather than dividing European countries and pressuring them into acquiescence, the threats appear to be unifying opposition and intensifying discussions about economic responses. New pressure seems to strengthen European resolve rather than weaken it. There are past reports of diplomatic tensions and influence-related incidents noted by Danish intelligence regarding foreign involvement, but no confirmed evidence that U.S. agencies are acting against NATO partners. According to some media reports citing Danish sources, there have been concerns about attempts to gather information about military installations in Greenland, though the specifics and attribution of these reports remain unclear. Officials reportedly told Danish media that Denmark should be prepared for various intelligence activities, though the extent and nature of any such activities remains uncertain. Intelligence gathering among allies, while sensitive, is not unprecedented, but the current context makes such reports particularly noteworthy. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen responded to the broader situation. The Kingdom of Denmark has strong support. At the same time, it's now even clearer that this matter extends beyond our borders. We want to cooperate, and it's not us who are seeking conflict. I'm pleased with the consistent message from the rest of the continent. Europe will not be pressured. Perhaps the most serious allegation involves claims about intelligence sharing. According to some reports, France and Ukraine may have conducted operations to test whether information shared with American officials was reaching Moscow. The alleged methodology involved providing fabricated intelligence and monitoring whether it appeared in Russian communications. These allegations are significant but remain unverified through official sources. If accurate, they would suggest serious breaches of alliance trust. However, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and confirmation of these reports from official sources or credible independent verification has not been established. European intelligence services may be operating with increased caution regarding information sharing, though the extent and basis of such caution is difficult to assess from public sources. The broader context of alliance tensions likely affects intelligence cooperation in various ways, but specific operational changes are not publicly confirmed. While trade tensions escalate in various directions, China's economy continues showing growth. China's GDP reportedly grew approximately 5% in 2025. The country has expanded trade partnerships beyond the United States, building economic relationships across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and increasingly with traditional American allies. The trade conflict was presumably designed to reduce Chinese economic influence and damage the Chinese economy. The results so far suggest mixed outcomes at best from that perspective. China appears to be diversifying and growing. American allies appear to be exploring relationships with Beijing. The United States faces increasing diplomatic isolation on various issues. The strategic irony is notable. Pressure campaigns that push allies toward alternative partnerships may strengthen rather than weaken the position of countries those campaigns were designed to contain. China's strategic position may be enhanced by tensions it did not create. The isolation extends beyond trade issues. At the United Nations, when the U.S. sought international support for action against Iran, the response was reportedly limited. Countries that might have supported such initiatives in the past, including Gulf states and regional powers, have expressed reservations about escalation. The pattern appears across multiple issues. On Greenland, most of the world appears to side with Denmark. On trade, allies explore relationships with China and each other. On Iran, traditional partners express caution about American approaches. The America First framing may be producing America alone outcomes in various contexts. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, herself a leader with nationalist political themes, has reportedly expressed skepticism about the Greenland approach. When leaders who might be expected to align ideologically express concerns, it suggests the policy has limited international support even among potential sympathizers. The diplomatic isolation has practical implications. When the United States needs international cooperation on sanctions, on military operations, on issues requiring allied support, it may find fewer willing partners. Countries that experience pressure and criticism tend not to rush to assist when called upon. Amid discussions about border security and drug flows, some inconvenient facts deserve attention. Reports indicate that significant drug shipments have been intercepted moving from the United States toward Canada, not just in the reverse direction. The flow of contraband across North American borders is more complex than simple narratives suggest. According to Canadian officials, weapons flows also deserve attention. American firearms flow into Canada and Mexico, contributing to violence that is sometimes used to justify aggressive policies toward those neighbors. The narrative of American victimhood from cross-border flows may obscure the reality of flows in both directions. This matters because aggressive policies toward neighbors have been justified partly based on claims about drugs and security threats. If the data suggests the United States is as much a source of cross-border problems as a victim of them, the justifications for those policies deserve scrutiny. The picture emerging is one of potential global reorganization, though the extent and permanence of changes remains uncertain. Europe discusses economic countermeasures while pursuing trade relationships with South America and others. Canada explores partnerships with China. Traditional American allies express reluctance to support various initiatives. Intelligence relationships may be affected by trust concerns. Whether this represents temporary friction or structural change depends on how current tensions evolve. Trade relationships being discussed now could shape economic flows for years. Infrastructure investments could create dependencies that outlast any particular administration. Alliance relationships damaged now may take significant time to repair. The EU's anti-coercion instrument remains a discussed option rather than an activated policy. Economic countermeasures are being debated, not implemented. The leverage represented by Treasury holdings is theoretical rather than being actively deployed. The gap between discussion and action remains significant. Meanwhile, various countries continue exploring trade relationships with each other. The EU-Mercosur discussions continue. Canada-China trade discussions proceed. Asian economies pursue further integration. African nations explore partnership diversification. The pattern of expanded relationships that don't depend on American participation is notable. European leaders have expressed clear positions in their public statements. Prime Minister Frederiksen speaks for many when she says Europe will not be pressured. The joint statement from 8 NATO nations demonstrates coordinated messaging. The discussions about economic countermeasures show the issue is being taken seriously. The question now is whether the Trump administration recognizes the depth of concern its approach has generated. Economic tensions with major trading partners, strained relationships with traditional allies, trust concerns affecting intelligence cooperation, allied nations exploring relationships specifically to reduce dependence on American goodwill. Pressure tactics may be producing effects opposite to their intentions. Tariff threats appear to have unified rather than divided European responses. Greenland pressure appears to have pushed Canada toward exploring Chinese partnerships. The approach seems to be accelerating trends it was presumably designed to prevent. European investors and central banks hold significant U.S. Treasury debt, which analysts note could theoretically be leveraged if trade conflicts escalated dramatically. But there is no confirmed plan to liquidate such holdings. This represents a theoretical form of economic leverage that is discussed in commentary, but not being actively deployed. The costs of such actions would be enormous for European economies as well. Selling Treasury holdings at scale would damage the value of remaining holdings. Triggering an American financial crisis would have global repercussions affecting European economies. The mutually destructive nature of such options makes their actual use highly uncertain. The EU's anti-coercion instrument exists as a legal tool, but has never been deployed against a major ally. Activating it against the United States would represent an unprecedented step with unpredictable consequences. The discussion of these tools reflects the seriousness of current tensions, but discussion is not the same as deployment. The administration appears to operate on the assumption that American economic and military power can compel compliance from allies and rivals. The emerging responses suggest that assumption is being tested. Whether pressure eventually produces the desired outcomes or accelerates the opposite trends remains the central question. The situation continues developing with significant uncertainty about outcomes. Economic countermeasures are being discussed but not yet implemented. Defensive exercises continue in Greenland. Trade diversification discussions proceed in various capitals. Alliance relationships remain strained but not broken. The stakes are significant for all parties. For Europe, the question is how to respond to pressure from a traditional ally without escalating to outcomes no one wants. For Canada, the challenge is navigating between an aggressive neighbor and alternative partnerships that carry their own complexities. For the United States, the risk is that pressure campaigns produce isolation rather than compliance. European countries have expressed that they will not be pressured into abandoning solidarity with Denmark. Canada appears to be exploring options to reduce vulnerability to American pressure. The broader international community appears skeptical of American approaches on various issues. Whether these tensions represent a temporary disruption or a more fundamental realignment depends on choices not yet made. The economic countermeasures being discussed could remain theoretical options rather than deployed weapons. Trade diversification could slow if American policies moderate. Alliance relationships could be repaired if trust is rebuilt. The world observes as these dynamics unfold. The outcomes will affect not just the immediate parties, but the broader international system that has operated since World War II. The rules governing trade, the meaning of alliance commitments, the limits of economic coercion, all are being tested by current tensions. What happens next depends on decisions in Washington, European capitals, Ottawa, and elsewhere. The consequences of those decisions will be felt by ordinary people in Greenland, across Europe, in Canada, and in the United States itself. The stakes are high, the uncertainty is significant, and the outcomes remain genuinely unclear.